Well, good afternoon, everybody. Again, we are in our Let's Talk About Labor podcast. For those of you who are not familiar with the podcast, and this podcast is a collaboration between the University of Tennessee and Gap Connections and aims to help you connect with farmers in Tennessee and other surrounding states, specifically to hear about their experiences using various U.S. temporary foreign visa programs to address their labor needs, as well as general strategies they use to overcome the labor challenges they are facing. We're also trying to connect you with individuals from government and not-profit organizations that could help you better navigate options related to addressing your labor needs. My name is Margarita Velandia, and I'm a professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Tennessee.
My name is Jane Chadwell, and I'm the Executive Director of Gap Connections, a nonprofit based here in Knoxville that works with farmers across the Southeast on labor issues.
My name is Amy Roachkis. I'm the Training and Resource Coordinator for Gap Connections, and I'd like to introduce today's guest, Lance Butler. Lance works for the Tennessee Department of Labor and Workforce Development. He oversees 4 programs: the H-2A and the H-2B visa program, the Migrant and Seasonal Farm Worker program, and the Senior Community Service Employment program. Thank you for joining us today, Lance.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
So in this episode of Let's Talk About Labor, we're going to visit with Lance about housing requirements for employers of migrant and seasonal agricultural workers, including H-2A workers. So to begin with, Lance, let's start by having you talk about housing regulations very briefly and as easy to understand as you can make it for employers that are providing housing under the Migrant and Seasonal Worker Protection Act and the H-2A program.
Yes, ma'am. So it's really pretty straightforward. For the housing regulations to do a pre-occupancy inspection for the H-2A program, there's 2 different regulation sets. However, they're synonymous with one another. There's just some nuances. Those regulations are buildings built before April 3rd, 1980, and then buildings built after 1980. And what these regulations essentially regulate, for lack of a better word, are what employers would need to follow to make sure that the housing they have to provide for MSFWs are up to standards. And that's it in a nutshell.
That's pretty easy.
That's exactly what we're looking for, Lance. Easy to understand. So let's jump a little bit on to a second question. So since you have traveled the state, visiting various farms across the state, could you please give us examples of housing options you have seen employers offering to the migrant and seasonal workers? And are there any housing options that are more common from the ones you have seen? So tell us a little bit about your experience on what you have seen when visiting these farms.
That's a great question. So there's a variety of housing. At least in Tennessee, you have barracks, which is your it can be one and the same. It can be your open floor plan where they eat, sleep, and watch TV in this one big open room. Or you have barrack types that are still an open floor plan, but the rooms are essentially separated from one another, from the kitchen and the relaxing areas. Another one, you have a common house. A lot of these farmers, I shouldn't say a lot, but some, the land is generational. It's been in the family for generations. So you might have an old farmhouse that the employer grew up on that now he has turned into migrant housing. Then you do have the option of hotels or motels as long as they're up to standard, as well as mobile homes. They're frequently used too, as long as those are up to standard. Now, in my experience, what I've seen is the majority of the housing is barracks or wood frame homes. Now, mobile homes are becoming utilized more as the H-2A program progresses, or at least in my experience, but those first two would be the most common.
Excellent, Lance.
Is there
Jane?
any one that you prefer more than the other, or you think that works better with a group of workers?
Yeah, my opinion, the barrack style. That's the one I would say I prefer. But I guess when it really comes to it, as long as it meets the regulations, it's clean and the workers are safe, I really don't care.
We are aware of very many requirements related to housing, including the space per person, sleeping, and cooking areas, and among others. In our previous episodes, farmers using the H-2A program mentioned some of those requirements. Could you walk through some of those requirements, such as space per person, the bed, the bathrooms, and specifically mention why these are established and why they're important for the workers that are there? We hear a lot about bed height. So if you can kind of explain the reasoning behind that, I think that would also be really interesting. Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no problem at all. So I would say like the most important regulations would be there has to be 50 square foot of sleeping area per man. So if you have 100 square foot room, you can fit two H-2A workers in there. As well as in each room, or there should be appliances that can be used to secure the migrant seasonal farm workers' possessions and items, such as a locker or a closet or a tote. Now that 50 square foot per man, and to secure their items, it's pretty self-explanatory. You don't want these individuals packed in the houses like sardines, right? So you have to be able to separate them, because only God knows what advantage that would be taking of. Also, the 12 inches off the ground rule. Why that was put into effect, I do not know, to be honest with you. But when we go out there, we do make sure that any bedding is 12 inches off the ground. I would assume that it's so things don't crawl over them and for sanitary purposes, As far as in the rooms and with the beds have to be 36 inches apart. Now that's if it's a single bed, right? Now, if you have bunk beds, those beds have to be 48 inches apart, of which 36 inches from the top of the mattress to the top of the ceiling. And of course, that's for head clearance. So when they raise up, they're not hitting their head, right? Another one, and one that you didn't mention, but I feel I need to mention, are bathrooms. These are a big point of contention when we go out to inspect, not only for cleanliness, but to make sure they have these select material or utensils, I should say, within the bathroom. That would be toilet. You can have one toilet per 15 people. Now, if it's a shared facility, so if you have men and women, right, and of course they're separated, you have to have a woman's bathroom and a men's bathroom. In a man's bathroom, you have to have one urinal per man, as well as it has to be clean, free of refuge. If there is a pest issue, you notice that it's being handled correctly, and it has to have a window for ventilation purposes. Okay. What else? Another one would be in the kitchen. We make sure that all the equipment is functioning properly, that we do have the fire guard behind the stove. The stove has to have at least 2 burners working. And that stove, I think it's 10 people per stove. I'd have to cite that regulation. I don't want to lie to you, but I'm pretty sure. No, I'm sorry. 1 burner per 10 people per stove. Yes, that's it. With a minimum of 2 eyes working. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, and so on the bathroom, I want to make sure that listeners understand when you say 1 per 15, as soon as they have 16 workers in there, they're going to have 2 bathrooms. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. Or they'll have to include another stall in the same bathroom.
And what about washing machines and dryers? I know that some people have them, some people don't. Kind of what's your experience with that?
I would recommend any employer that's going to do this to get a washer and dryer, and also go over with the workers how to properly use it. because some of the farmers I've spoken to over the years is, you know, this gentleman said, I just came in the house to check on them, make sure they're all right, if they didn't need anything. And I found that they were drying their boots in my dryer. And he was like, and I had to replace one last year. So, circumstances like that. Now, they do not have to provide, they being the employer, they do not have to provide a washer and a dryer. They have to provide them the ability to wash and dry their clothes, right? So if they say, for an example, only have a washer, then they have to provide clotheslines for them to dry their clothes. If they don't have a washer or dryer, then they have to give them ready and reliable transportation to a laundromat or facilities comparable to that.
Okay. And on the securable area for their items, I just want to, does that mean that it has to be lockable, or just it is closed, kind of nothing can get in and out of it?
And that's a good question. Some of these regulations are a relative, open to interpretation, I should say. When I think secure, I think something lockable. You can put a lock on it. The worker knows he's safe. He has nothing to worry about. However, it doesn't specify what that means.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I know that we recommend to a lot of the farmers we work with and at Gap Connections for it to be lockable, so that they can keep some of their documents and things there in a secure lockable space. But I certainly understand things are open to interpretation.
Yes, ma'am. I would encourage you to continue to encourage them in that way.
All right. Well, so Lance, we are aware that some employers offer rental accommodations to the workers, like including hotels. Could you briefly talk about general recommendations if an employer was going to house workers in a hotel, and what they would need to do if they're housing workers in a hotel?
Okay, yeah. So hotels can be used. If they are used, they still have to follow the regulations, the housing regulations for the H-2A program. However, say if one regulation is not in line with the county codes of where the hotel is located, then those codes will supersede the regulation as long as it's still safe and livable, if that makes sense. The beds still have to be, the same distance apart. It's still 50 square feet per room. They still have to offer a shower area. They still have to offer an area for them to lock their belongings. Where it can get a little hazy, and again, it depends on the codes in the county, is sometimes these farmers will give them a hot plate, and that's their kitchen facility, right? However, sometimes you run into, fire hazard issues, things of that manner. So if that's the case, then just make sure that any employer checks the codes, and of course the hotel motel owners are okay with it. But those are utilized pretty frequently, Amy.
So yeah, I was going to ask, that was kind of my follow-up question. How many growers are using hotels when we look about Tennessee area?
Okay, so I can't quantify that just right off the top of my head. However, I would say maybe 1 out of every 7. And the last time that I checked our spreadsheet, we're up to I think it was 589 employers in Tennessee. So that's still quite a bit.
And are these, give me an example of like what type of hotels? Are these, the common flagship hotels you see when you're traveling? What kind of, give me an idea. Are these smaller motels that are more locally owned? What do they look like?
Yes, ma'am. So it depends on where the farm is located as to which hotel they may or may not use. And of course, it depends if it's financially advantageous for them to use, say, a local vendor, or say like a chain vendor, right? I've noticed that it's more, I would say, local companies that they use. However, I have seen them put them in a Hyatt, a Quinta Inn, Holiday Inn, what is that? Best Western Nine or Western Nine, something like that. We have seen those as well.
And are these commonly direct employers, or do you see more farm labor contractors using hotels?
Farm labor contractors. Or let me rephrase that, the H-2A employers. And they'll put the H-2A visa holders in there. Sometimes, I will add this, sometimes the housing that we're supposed to inspect isn't ready for the employer, but as not to delay the arrival of the workers, they rent a hotel for a specified amount of time and then move them back over. So they can use those in tandem as well.
Oh, that's an interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about that part of it. Kind of when you need that temporary need.
Yes, ma'am.
Margarita, Jane, do you have any other questions for Lance?
No, I think Lance educate us very well
He
Thank you,
on
did.
all
Jane.
these regulations and options that we have there. So we really thank you, Lance, for educating us and our audience on housing regulations, inspections, and options they might have.
Yes, ma'am. You're most
All
welcome.
right.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, Lance, for joining us today. In our next podcast, we are going to continue discussing housing, specifically housing inspections. See you in the next episode.